Why no contact hurts avoidance more than you think. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to run from something thinking you were escaping, only to realize you were running straight into pain? That's exactly what happens to avoidant people in relationships. They pull away, they create distance, they build walls because somewhere deep inside they believe that closeness equals pain, that intimacy is a trap. So when you go no contact, when you give them exactly what they think they want, you think they're unaffected. But here's the truth. Avoidants suffer more than they let on. They act like they're fine. They might even convince themselves they're relieved. But here's what's really happening. The silence, it doesn't bring them peace. It brings them discomfort. It forces them to face the void they've been avoiding their entire lives. See, avoidance isn't about not caring. It's about fear, the fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of losing themselves, the fear that love equals pain. So when you go no contact, they don't just miss you. You're left alone with the very feelings they've been running from. And that's when it starts to hurt. But here's the catch. Most avoidants won't admit it. They'll bury the pain, they'll keep themselves busy, but deep down, they're forced to confront something uncomfortable. They wanted connection all along, they just didn't know how to handle it. Now, I'm not saying no contact is wrong. Sometimes it's the best move for your own healing. But don't ever believe the lie that an avoidant doesn't feel it. Because trust me, when you remove your presence, you remove their emotional safety net, and that shakes them more than you think. So if you're sitting there thinking they don't care, that they're untouched by your absence, think again. Silence is powerful, and for the avoidant, it's the one thing they've spent their whole life trying to escape. Avoidants aren't emotionless. They're fearful. They don't shut down because they don't care, but because they've learned somewhere along the way that emotions are unsafe. It's not about indifference, it's about protection. People with avoidant attachment styles often grow up in environments where emotional needs were not met, where vulnerability led to pain, or where independence was rewarded while dependency was discouraged. Over time, they develop a subconscious belief that relying on someone else is dangerous, that emotional intimacy equals a loss of control, and that the best way to stay safe is to stay distant. When an avoidant person pulls away, it's rarely because they don't love or value their partner. Instead, it's because closeness triggers an internal alarm. The moment they feel emotionally overwhelmed, their brain goes into self-preservation mode. It tells them to create distance, to detach, to retreat into solitude where they feel most in control. It's like a reflex, an automatic response they've been practicing their whole lives. To an outsider, it might look cold, uncaring, or even cruel, but inside the mind of an avoidant, it's survival. This is why they often seem unaffected when a partner goes no contact. They might appear as if they've moved on instantly, as if they don't feel the loss, but that's not because they're incapable of love. It's because their primary coping mechanism is suppression. When emotions become too intense, they push them down, they compartmentalize, they distract themselves. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment style who seeks closeness when they feel emotional pain, avoidants do the opposite. They shut off their emotions like a switch, not realizing that suppressing emotions doesn't make them disappear, it only delays the pain. What most people don't realize is that avoidants crave love just as much as anyone else. They may not show it in the same way, but deep inside there's a part of them that longs for deep connection. The problem is they associate closeness with suffocation. If they grew up in an environment where their emotional needs were neglected or dismissed, they learn to rely only on themselves. This belief becomes so ingrained that even when they enter a relationship with someone they truly care about, their instinct is still to protect themselves from getting too close. They don't consciously push people away because they want to be alone. They do it because they don't trust that closeness can be safe. Avoidants also struggle with recognizing their own emotions in real time. While someone with an anxious attachment might immediately feel the sting of rejection or loss, an avoidant may not process these emotions until much later. This delayed reaction is one of the reasons why avoidants often seem fine after a breakup. Their mind has trained them to numb themselves to the initial pain. But once the distraction fades, once the external world quiets down, they are left alone with the very emotions they were trying to escape. And this is where no contact becomes truly painful for them. At first, they may feel relief, a sense of regained control, but over time, that relief is replaced by a deep, unsettling void. They begin to feel the absence, and because they've spent their lives avoiding the emotional discomfort, they often don't have the tools to process it properly. They may convince themselves they never really cared that much in the first place, but deep down, something is shifting. The emotions they suppress start creeping back in, and for someone who has spent their whole life running from feelings, that can be an incredibly uncomfortable experience. So while avoidance might look like they're indifferent to no contact, the truth is they feel it in a way that's different, but just as intense. They don't experience the immediate emotional outbursts that anxious individuals do, but they do experience a slow-burning realization of loss. The pain is not absent, it's just delayed. No contact forces an avoidant to face their biggest fear, disconnection. At first glance, it might seem like an avoidant person would welcome the silence. After all, they're known for needing space, pulling away when things get too emotionally intense, and valuing independence above all else. But what many people don't realize is that avoidants don't create distance because they don't care. They do it because they are afraid of emotional entanglement, of losing themselves in a relationship, or of being hurt in ways they don't know how to handle. They convince themselves that solitude is their safe space, but the moment no contact is enforced, they are met with a reality they were never fully prepared for: true disconnection. An avoidant person operates under a paradox. They desire connection just like anyone else, but they also fear it. Their need for independence is not a preference as much as it is a survival mechanism. It comes from a deep-rooted belief that closeness leads to discomfort and that distancing themselves is the best way to maintain emotional control. However, this belief is built on avoidance rather than true emotional security. They are not at peace in their solitude. They are simply distracting themselves from the vulnerability that closeness brings. When no contact happens, an avoidant is suddenly faced with the very thing they were trying to avoid: a complete severing of the emotional connection. In a normal cycle, they withdraw when they feel overwhelmed, expecting that when they return, the connection will still be there, waiting for them. They assume that even if they create distance, the person they pulled away from will still be available, still care, and still reach out in some way. But when no contact is enforced, that assumption shatters. The emotional safety net they unknowingly relied on is gone, and they are left with nothing but their own suppressed emotions. At first, they might not even register the impact. Avoidants are skilled at compartmentalizing their emotions. They will throw themselves into work, hobbies, new distractions, or even new relationships. They might convince themselves that the silence is a relief, that they are finally free from the pressure of emotional intimacy. But over time, something changes. The absence of connection doesn't just remove the source of their emotional overwhelm, it removes the comfort of knowing that someone is still emotionally invested in them. That realization is far more jarring than they ever expected. What makes no contact so powerful is that it eliminates the very thing that allowed the avoidant to feel secure in their distancing behaviors, the ability to return when they're ready. Avoidants often assume that they have control over when and how they reconnect with people. They believe that if they need space, they can take it, and when they're ready, they can come back without consequences. No contact disrupts that pattern entirely. It tells them that space doesn't always mean safety, it can mean loss. As time passes, an avoidant begins to feel the weight of the silence. It doesn't hit them all at once like it might for an anxious person, but it creeps in slowly. They start to wonder why the person they distanced themselves from hasn't reached out. They start to feel the lack of attention, the missing presence, the absence of a person who once made them feel valued. And because they have spent so much of their lives suppressing emotions, they don't have the tools to deal with this discomfort in a healthy way. This is why avoidants often struggle when no contact is enforced for an extended period. They are forced to process feelings they have spent years avoiding. They can no longer rely on the assumption that the connection will always be there. Instead, they have to sit with the realization that their need for distance may have cost them something irreplaceable. And that realization, no matter how much they try to suppress it, hurts more than they ever expected. Their silence doesn't mean they're fine. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is that their lack of communication or outward emotion means they are unaffected by no contact. People assume that because they are not reaching out, expressing sadness, or visibly reacting, they must have moved on effortlessly. But that assumption couldn't be further from the truth. Avoidants don't process emotions the same way others do. Their instinct is not to express feelings, but to suppress them. Their silence is not a reflection of their emotional state, it is a defense mechanism. Avoidants have spent most of their lives learning to push down uncomfortable emotions. This behavior often develops in childhood, where they may have been taught, directly or indirectly, that showing emotions led to rejection, discomfort, or even punishment. When a child's emotional needs are not met consistently, they adapt by shutting down those needs altogether. Over time, this pattern solidifies into a belief that emotions, especially those tied to vulnerability and connection, are a threat rather than something to be embraced. So when no contact is initiated, an avoidant's first reaction is not distress but detachment. Their brain immediately goes into self-preservation mode, telling them that they don't need the person who has stepped away. They might even feel relief at first, thinking they have successfully avoided another emotionally overwhelming situation. They tell themselves that they are better off alone, that they never needed the relationship in the first place. But what's actually happening is that their body and mind are delaying the emotional impact rather than erasing it. Instead of feeling their emotions in real time, avoidants tend to experience a delayed emotional response. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment, who immediately feels the pain of separation, an avoidant person's coping mechanism is to bury the pain until it can no longer be ignored. So this delay can last days, weeks, or even months, depending on the depth of the connection. In the meantime, they fill their lives with distractions, work, hobbies, social events, or even new relationships. Anything that keeps them from sitting in silence with their own thoughts. But avoidance is not the same as healing. Just because an avoidant isn't outwardly expressing sadness doesn't mean they aren't feeling it. The longer they go without contact, the more the reality of the absence begins to sink in. They might catch themselves expecting a message that never comes, thinking about shared memories, or wondering why the person they once kept at arm's length has not tried to reconnect. And because they struggle with identifying and processing emotions, these feelings often manifest as irritation, frustration, or even numbness rather than obvious sadness. Avoidants don't just avoid others, they avoid themselves. When faced with no contact, they are forced to confront the very emotions they have spent their entire lives running from. They start to realize that the emotional distance they created wasn't protecting them from pain, it was only postponing it. And when that pain finally surfaces, it can be overwhelming. But instead of reaching out, many avoidants double down on their detachment, convincing themselves that they don't care, even when their actions suggest otherwise. This is why so many people misinterpret an avoidant silence as indifference. The truth is, avoidants don't respond in the way most people expect because they are trapped in their own internal battle. They struggle to acknowledge their own emotions, let alone express them to someone else. So while it might look like they are perfectly fine, beneath the surface they are wrestling with a discomfort they don't know how to handle. The pain is there, it just doesn't show up in the way most people recognize. They wanted connection all along, but didn't know how to handle it. Avoidants are often misunderstood as people who don't need or desire deep emotional bonds, but the truth is far more complex. They crave connection, just like anyone else, but their relationship with intimacy is complicated. Deep down, there is a part of them that longs for closeness, but at the same time, they fear it. They've spent so much of their lives associating emotional intimacy with discomfort, loss of control, or even rejection that they don't know how to embrace it in a healthy way. This fear of closeness doesn't come from a lack of feeling, it comes from too much feeling. Many avoidants have a heightened sensitivity to emotions, but instead of expressing them openly, they suppress them as a survival mechanism. Somewhere along the way, they learned that emotional vulnerability led to pain. Maybe their caregivers were emotionally unavailable, dismissive, or inconsistent. Maybe they were rewarded for being independent and discouraged from expressing neediness. Over time, they internalized the belief that relying on someone else was dangerous, that emotional closeness would only lead to disappointment, and that the safest way to navigate relationships was to keep people at a comfortable distance. Because of this, avoidants often send mixed signals in relationships. They enjoy the warmth of connection, but once it starts to feel too intense, they instinctively withdraw. This isn't because they don't care, it's because deep connection feels unfamiliar and overwhelming. When someone gets too close, their nervous system perceives it as a threat. They may start to feel trapped, overstimulated, or even irritated, not realizing that these feelings are actually masking a deeper fear of vulnerability. In their minds, distance equals safety and closeness equals risk. But here's where the real struggle begins. Despite their efforts to maintain emotional independence, avoidants still form attachments. They might not express it in the same way an anxious person would, but they do bond with people on a deep level. They just don't know how to manage that bond in a way that doesn't feel suffocating. When they feel connected to someone, a quiet internal battle begins. The desire for closeness clashes with the fear of losing themselves in the relationship. This inner conflict often leads to push and pull dynamics where they seek connection one moment and retreat the next. When no contact is enforced, avoidants are forced to confront the fact that the connection they once had is no longer available. At first, they may feel relieved, as if they regain control over their emotions. But as time passes, something unexpected happens. They start to feel the absence in a way they didn't anticipate. Because they are used to keeping emotions at bay, they don't immediately recognize what they are feeling. It might show up as irritation, restlessness, or even an inexplicable sense of emptiness. They may not consciously acknowledge that they miss the relationship, but their actions start to reveal the truth. Many avoidants struggle to understand their own emotional needs. They have spent so much time avoiding vulnerability that when faced with true disconnection, they don't have the tools to process it properly. They might try to convince themselves that they never really cared, that the relationship didn't matter, or that they are better off alone. But deep inside, something feels off. The stability, support, and emotional presence they once had is gone, and they don't know how to fill that space. This is why avoidants often take longer to feel the impact of no contact. Their emotional processing is delayed, but it is not absent. They eventually realize that the connection meant more to them than they allowed themselves to believe. And when that realization hits, it's not just painful, it's unsettling. Because, for the first time, they are faced with a truth they've been running from their entire lives. They wanted closeness all along. They just didn't know how to hold on to it. No contact is powerful because it removes what they once took for granted. Avoidants operate under the assumption that space is always available to them, that they can create distance whenever they feel overwhelmed, and that when they are ready, they can return. This pattern is deeply ingrained in how they handle relationships. They withdraw when emotions feel too intense, expecting that the other person will still be there when they decide to re-engage. However, when no contact is enforced, it disrupts this expectation entirely. Suddenly, the connection they assumed was secure is gone, and for the first time, they are faced with the reality that their avoidance has consequences. At first, they may not even recognize the impact. Avoidants are skilled at detaching from emotions, so their initial response is often relief. They may tell themselves that they have regained control, that they no longer have to navigate the complexities of emotional intimacy, or that life feels easier without the pressure of a relationship, but this relief is superficial. It is not true freedom. It is just the absence of an emotional trigger. Without realizing it, they depended on the relationship to provide a sense of security, even if they resisted its emotional demands. As time passes, the absence begins to register in ways they did not anticipate. Avoidants do not typically process emotions in the moment. Instead, they suppress and compartmentalize them. But emotions, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. The quiet moments become louder. The distractions they once relied on start to feel empty. They might notice small things, a song, a phrase, a place they used to go together, that bring an unexpected wave of discomfort. This discomfort is unfamiliar to them, and because they are not used to confronting their feelings directly, they may struggle to understand what is happening. One of the biggest realizations avoidants face during no contact is that the connection they had was not as easily replaceable as they once believed. Many avoidants hold this subconscious belief that relationships are interchangeable, that if one ends, another can take its place without much emotional fallout. But when no contact is maintained, they are forced to sit with the loss. They begin to realize that the bond they had was unique, that the person they distanced themselves from was not just another option, but someone who provided a sense of stability they did not fully appreciate at the time. This realization often comes too late. By the time an avoidant recognizes the impact of no contact, the other person has likely moved on or set firm boundaries that prevent them from returning. This is where the pain deepens. Avoidants struggle with emotional regulation, so when they finally allow themselves to feel the loss, it can be overwhelming. They may experience regret, confusion, or even anger, not necessarily at the other person, but at themselves for letting the relationship slip away. However, instead of expressing this openly, many avoidants double down on their defense mechanisms, convincing themselves that they are better off alone, or that relationships are inherently flawed. No contact is so powerful because it removes the emotional safety net that avoidants rely on. It forces them to confront the reality that people do not wait forever, that emotional detachment has real consequences, and that relationships require effort to maintain. While an avoidant may never openly admit that they are struggling, the absence speaks louder than any word. They are left with a truth they can no longer avoid. The connection they thought they could take for granted is gone, and they are left to face the void they spent so much time trying to escape. At the end of the day, avoidants aren't immune to pain, they just process it differently. No contact doesn't just affect those with anxious attachment styles, it forces avoidants to confront emotions they've spent their whole lives avoiding. The silence they initially see as relief eventually turns into an empty space they don't know how to fill. They realize, sometimes too late, that the connection they pushed away wasn't something they could just replace. They feel the weight of disconnection in a way they never expected. But here's the truth. Growth comes from discomfort. Avoidants may struggle with emotional intimacy, but that doesn't mean they are incapable of change. When they are forced to sit with their emotions instead of running from them, they have a choice: to repeat old patterns or to break free from them. No contact isn't just about letting go of someone who couldn't show up for you. It's about giving them the space to recognize their own patterns and hopefully evolve. If you've enforced no contact, remember this: your absence is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary boundary. You are not punishing an avoidant by stepping back. You are simply choosing to honor your own worth. And sometimes the most powerful lesson someone can learn is what happens when they can no longer take your presence for granted. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Whether you resonate with this message personally or know someone who does, I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of the complexities of attachment and the silent struggles that many people face. Growth isn't easy, and healing doesn't happen overnight, but awareness is the first step. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unappreciated in a relationship, know this: you deserve connection that doesn't require you to shrink yourself. You deserve to be met with the same depth and presence that you give to others. Keep growing, keep healing, and most importantly, keep choosing yourself. Thank you.